We begin the program with a grim outlook from the UN. It says global tourism losses from the pandemic could top $4 trillion. It also found that slow vaccination rollouts in developing countries are adding to the mounting economic impact. As Natasha Hussain reports, the UN expects international tourism to only return to pre-pandemic levels in 2023 at the earliest.
Somsak Betlao wraps up another day on Phuket with 0 tourists needing his boat services. Before the pandemic, he earned more than $100 a day ferrying tourists to other Thai islands. Now, he's lucky if he brings home $40 a month. But he's pinning his hopes on a government scheme to bring back international tourists called the Phuket Sandbox. It will reopen the island, and only the one island, to vaccinated visitors. Not everyone, though, is as optimistic.
What's going to happen? We open the Phuket Sandbox in the 1st of July. The tourists will come and see nothing. You see like the building on sale, building for rent, the shop closed, the convenience store closed, Starbucks closed also, you know that, right? And you think it's a good environment for the tourists? No.
A UN report has presented a grim outlook for the tourism sector. The joint report by the UN Conference on Trade and Development and the UN's World Tourism Organization forecasts a slow recovery.
The loss could be again in 2021 2.4 trillion of global GDP. In the optimistic scenario, it's a bit better. It's a loss of 1.7 trillion US dollar.
In 2020, global tourist arrivals declined by about 1 billion, that's 73%, from pre-pandemic levels in 2019. The downward trend continued in 2021, dropping by 88% in the first quarter, again from numbers seen before the pandemic.
We are currently in international tourism, we are at levels of 30 years ago. So basically, we are in the years 80s. So not much crowd. We have lost 1 billion travelers, so 1 billion opportunities for people to build livelihoods, especially in developing countries.
Researchers say the sector's recovery will largely depend on the uptake of COVID-19 vaccines around the world. But vaccination rates are uneven, ranging from 1% in some developing nations to 60% in richer countries. Wealthier nations like the US, UK, and France are expected to recover faster due to higher vaccination rates. But even then, the report expects it to take years for tourism to bounce back due to travel restrictions, the slow containment of the virus, and an overall poor economic environment. Natasha Hussain, TRT World.
For more on this, let's bring in the chief of the International Trade and Commodities Division at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Carlos Razo in Geneva. He's also the co-author of this report. Welcome to the show. Now, before we talk about the outlook, tell us how much damage has the pandemic already caused to global tourism?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Well, so far as some of the things you were pointing out, some of my colleagues, there was a big reduction in international travel. There was a contraction of 74% from last year, and that created a massive disruption in the economy. Our estimations are about the cost of tourism decline in 2020 amount to $2.4 trillion. So to put it into context, for instance, that could be like three times the GDP of Turkey. So this is the magnitude of that loss.
That's huge. Now, when we talk about the outlook, of course, unequal access to the vaccine is becoming a challenge for much of the world. How does it affect the tourism industry, especially in the developing economies?
Well, vaccination is a key factor, and it affects it in 2 different ways. First, on what we economists call the supply side. So on the health of the workers in the tourism areas. So you need the vaccines to make sure that they can operate in a safe environment and that they can actually work. That's on one side. On the other side, you have the situation that if your country, the rate of vaccination is low, you cannot lift travel restrictions because your population is still vulnerable. So that affects tourism. In addition, if the conditions in your country are deemed unsafe by foreign tourists, they will not come to your country, to your area, and that will undoubtedly also affect the demand for tourism in the destination. So access to vaccines is fundamental to restart traveling around the world.
All right, now when we look at the report, there are a few different scenarios that you've highlighted. Could you just tell us a bit more about those?
Yes, of course. You know, the first scenario, and probably I need to tell you something, that now during this COVID-19 period, being a forecaster is very, very difficult. So that's why we try to design three different scenarios. One is considers the forecast from the UN World Trade Tourism Organization. That is a similar fall in tourism as last year, and therefore the loss will be very similar, around $2.4 trillion. The other scenario is a little bit more positive and assumes that some travel restrictions will be lifted thanks to the vaccination rates, and that therefore it will be a little bit slow. So then that could create a loss of $1.7 trillion, which is still a very important loss. The third scenario, which I think, or we think is important to consider, is when you have different vaccination rates. And this is important to see because in the previous scenarios, we assume a contraction in tourism all across the board, all countries more or less equal. When you look at the different vaccination rates, developing countries are at a disadvantage. So when that happens, there is a loss of $1.8 trillion. But the big difference is that 60% of that loss accrues to developing countries. So these are the three scenarios. These are the expectations. And this is why the uneven vaccination rate can have a heavy impact on developing countries and their ability to recover the tourism industries.